New America was fascinated by the ancients. Classical Greece, Republican Rome. The values of these civilizations became American ideals too. Democracy, civic responsibility, public virtue. Their imagery saturated American culture right from the Republic's beginning in the 18th century and continues in weirdly mutated forms sometimes down to the present day. What would the Founding Fathers have made of this modern site of American classicism, Las Vegas? To them it would have seemed eerily familiar and yet scarcely recognizable. They thought the classical column held up the Republican temple of virtue. We prefer it to support the popular palace of middle-class sin.
Today there aren't too many classicists in a place like Las Vegas, but the allure of Rome, like old man Tiber, just keeps on rolling along. Except that it's a different Rome, not the virtuous republic of George Washington, but rather the late empire of Frank Sinatra and Bob Guccione. Caesars and senators, centurions and slave girls, the Rome of Hollywood of excess and authority, heavily overlaid with pasta, meatballs and pets of the month. There are places in Italy where you can still escape the classical past, but in America it's not so easy.
This is Caesar's Mall, a moon colony for shoppers in the Nevada desert with a sky that cycles through from rosy dawn to purple dusk every half hour with computer-controlled lights. It is not what 18th century Americans had in mind when they called for a public architecture based upon the severe forms of ancient Rome. The new republic was weak, only its ideals were strong. Classicism gave it a language of power and authority and of continuity with the past, even though it was so new. To choose a new capital is a radical act for any state. The Founding Fathers of the American Republic didn't want to take an existing city like New York or Philadelphia and just call it the capital of the United States of America. They wanted a clean slate, a very American desire, an empty site where the Republican vision would not be blurred by earlier royalist and colonial meanings.
The place they chose in 1791 was empty, all right, because up to then nobody in his right mind would have wanted to live there. It was a tract of hot, humid marshland beside the Potomac River with a few tobacco farms and a large and rich variety of animal life, mostly mosquitoes. But this was to be the site of the new Rome, and they called it Washington. A mere hypothesis at first, just a bunch of lines on a surveyor's map, but it was to grow into the most powerful city on earth.
The ambitions of the revolutionary leaders, among them George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, were large, and they found expression in the plan for the capital of the new republic. It takes its form from the greatest metaphor of royal autocracy in France, the gardens of Versailles, designed by Le Nôtre for Louis XIV in the 17th century. Washington's designer was also French, an engineer named Pierre L'Enfant. Versailles' imagery of great corridors of power radiating from the palace becomes L'Enfant's plan of grid and boulevards. A hugely ambitious design, and it took more than a century to fill it in. And yet this ambition allowed the Founding Fathers to show how they rejected the Englishness that was all around them. This had become one of the more disliked buildings of the old regime, the English governor's palace in Williamsburg, capital of the colony of Virginia. Its architecture is English, not French, in origin. The balcony signifies government by proclamation, the governor issuing his orders from above to the king's subjects below. When you, the colonist, entered the hall and saw the 774 weapons that decorated it, you might have been reassured by the display of military power. And if you had any Republican thoughts, you might have been intimidated. But this kind of building, and the town it anchored as an image of royal authority, had nothing like the symbolic charge that the American revolutionaries imagined for their architecture. A young man who studied law in Williamsburg wrote that its architecture was in the worst style I ever saw, and said of Virginia in general that the genius of architecture has cast its maledictions over this land. This was Thomas Jefferson, and he would become the third president of the United States. But he was an architect before the Revolution. His father gave him a classical education, a political background, and thousands of acres of rural Virginia. By 1767, he was designing himself a house on a hill deep in the Virginian countryside near Charlottesville. He called it Monticello. He was to work on it, tinker with it, for the best part of 40 years. Monticello is pervaded with enormous aesthetic ambition. It was also this great amateur's spiritual centre, his hearth, and his refuge from the painful stress of political life.
If I had to pick one person from all the dead Americans that I wish I could talk to, that man would be Thomas Jefferson, and the reason is the overwhelmingly attractive cast of his mind. He was one of those rare people who want to build everything up from first principles and do it without a trace of fanaticism or self-pity or cant. He was the living proof of William Blake's dictum that energy is eternal delight. He was revolutionary, statesman, diplomat, president, constitutionalist, educator, farmer, botanist, and the founder of American architecture. Reading him, you feel his enthusiasm and curiosity on your face like sunburn. He lived far beyond his means and was constantly in debt from the huge sums that he spent building and furnishing Monticello. And under the surface of the 18th century Whig reasonableness, there is something immoderate and crazy about Jefferson, and, very important from my point of view, he was the patron saint of all do-it-yourselfers, a fact to which Monticello bears witness.
He was always looking for details of convenience. The portholes in the wall up there above his bed are there to ventilate his winter wardrobe. He designed a machine to make copies of his letters, and he wrote about 18,000 of them over his lifetime. He designed a clock to record the days of the week as well as the time of day. Cannonball weights moved down the walls past the day markers. Unfortunately, the hall of Monticello wasn't high enough, so he had to cut a hole in the floor and put the rest of the days in the cellar. Jefferson's masterpiece is his University of Virginia in Charlottesville. He saw that education was the key to the life of the new republic. He believed in what he called natural aristocracy, elites of talent and virtue, not of birth and privilege, which education could create from the ranks of ordinary Americans.
It was dedicated, he said, to the illimitable freedom of the human mind. It would be a pure expression of the Enlightenment without any input from religion. For Jefferson was a secular humanist through and through. How today's religious right would have disliked him, and how very little he would have thought of them.
The campus, which Jefferson called his academical village, is built around a lawn open at one end, so that, in a symbolic sense, knowledge and wisdom could radiate down and out into the American landscape. It is made of pavilions, set on increasing spaces as they recede from the eye, like a Palladian stage set. Each pavilion has classrooms at ground level and professors' quarters above. Between them are the students' dorms. Each of the 10 pavilions is built in a variant on the classical styles of architecture: Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and so on. The pavilions, said Jefferson, are cubic architecture, but the climax of the project, the rotunda, begun in 1823, he called spherical. It was based on the Pantheon in Rome. Within is the library, the round cranium of the university, literally its brain. Light floods it from the round skylight above, representing the power of nature. The books radiate the power of reason. Originally, Jefferson wanted to take this metaphor further by painting the dome sky blue and having gilt planets and stars moved across it by a sky clock. Even without that, it's a pristine space, a precinct of intellectual light, clarity and harmony. To me, this is the most beautiful room in America. Once you've seen it, you understand why Jefferson wanted to be remembered not as President of the United States, but as the author of the Declaration of Independence, the founder of religious liberty in Virginia, and the designer of this university. Even after a century of glass and steel, when we think of public buildings, we still think of columns and porticos. The very first temple-form political building in America, or indeed the modern world, was the new State House in Richmond, Virginia, designed by Jefferson in 1785. Jefferson was totally enraptured by an ancient Roman temple he visited in Nîmes, the Maison Carrée, or Square House. "Here I am, madame," he wrote to a friend in Paris, "gazing whole hours at the Maison Carrée like a lover at his mistress." He had a stucco model made of it and shipped it back to Richmond, and he bullied the legislature into accepting it as the basis of the new design. At the core of the State House, where the statue of the god would have gone in a real Roman temple, there is a figure of George Washington. It was commissioned in 1788 from the French sculptor Jean-Antoine Houdon, and he gave America its first really good public sculpture, a superb display of neoclassical style and intelligence. Insofar as a single figure can, this expresses an idea about democracy. It shows the statesman as citizen, not a king, not a god, but first among equals. Jefferson specified that the size should be precisely that of a man. Anything bigger would be pretentious. So we don't see Washington as victorious general. He's a new Cincinnatus, the Roman hero who was called from civilian life to lead the army and returned to his farm after victory. He leans on a bundle of rods, the Roman fasces, each rod a state, their union connoting strength. His sword is sheathed. And then there's the plough, the symbol of agrarian virtue and the planting of a new political order. Houdon's final touch, a marvellous one, I think, is Washington's missing button. It lets you know that he's not a stickler for protocol. Democracy in dress. In reality, the Founding Fathers were more of a secular elite than Americans commonly imagine. Jefferson and Washington were both Freemasons. This is the largest Masonic temple in America, built in Alexandria, Virginia. It's modelled, supposedly, on Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem and dedicated to George Washington, whose flame is kept alight by the keepers of the shrine. But now inflation has set in. Washington is not the size of a man. He is a bronze colossus, 4 times life size.
George Washington, of course, was the most prominent Freemason. Harry Truman was a devoted Freemason. He dedicated the statue of George Washington in 1950. Over 50% of those who signed our Constitution were Freemasons. Over 50% who signed the Declaration of Independence were also Freemasons. And we have had 14 presidents documented as being Freemasons. And their conduct in office pretty well indicates to most of us that they have had good moral training, which probably was a result of the obligations that they assumed when they became Masons.
Masonic imagery was so important in the politics of the American Enlightenment that it even found its way onto the dollar bill, the eye of universal knowledge above the pyramid with the motto, "A New Order of the Ages." In the 20th century, it would be lampooned by the American Dadaist Man Ray with his satirical sculpture made from a metronome called Object to be Destroyed. But the biggest Masonic image of all was the monument to George Washington in the city that bears his name. 555 feet high, the biggest obelisk ever made, beyond the wildest dreams of the pharaohs. The Washington Monument is so much a part of America's mental landscape by now that it's hard to imagine anyone ever objected to it. But they did, vehemently. The political fuss and bother over the designs was so great that this one wasn't actually approved until 1848, nor was it finished until 1885. And in the meantime, every imaginable faction got in on the act. Some politicians thought the simpler designs didn't pay enough respect to the great Washington, and other people thought the more elaborate designs made him out to be a Caesar or a king, but not a Democrat. At one point it was even proposed that all the surviving veterans of the Revolutionary War of 1776 should somehow or other be brought to Washington, where they would each fling several shovelfuls of earth on this site, thereby creating a large mound over the memory of the great man, a kind of national anthill. But in the end, an army engineer came up with a perfect and abstract form with a steam elevator inside to get people to the top, the tallest stone structure in the world. Its critics compared it to a stalk of asparagus, and Mark Twain thought it looked like a factory chimney with the tip broken off. But it is also a colossus whose figure is absent, sublimated. Its impersonal beauty takes your breath away. It's the midpoint between the first heroic style of America, Neoclassicism, and the last one, minimal art. The profusion of monuments in Washington make this city into a sort of theme park representing the tides of history. Each monument is partly a shrine and partly a ride. Abraham Lincoln described the aura of the American monument when he spoke of the mystic chords of memory uniting Americans with one another through their past. The Lincoln Memorial, designed 50 years after the president's death by Henry Bacon, is deservedly the most famous. Its colossal figure of Lincoln by the sculptor Daniel Chester French sits enthroned in a temple like Zeus, gazing down the main axis of the city towards the Capitol.
When you move into that great memorial and you look up and you see the statue of Abraham Lincoln, it's impressive. But let me say that when you turn and look at the words inscribed on the marble and read the words of that second inaugural, I think it is the most beautiful piece of literature written in the English language. I can hardly read it without tears because of what he was saying to the people. Remember, in Britain, you have the pageantry, you have the monarchy, you have all of this that is a glue to society. It brings people together. It creates community. And we're trying to do that with our architecture, at the same time maintain our democratic concepts and ideals.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up.
Monuments live by use and die by neglect. The world is studded with dead monuments. The Lincoln Memorial was revived by civil rights rallies 30 years ago when Martin Luther King and hundreds of thousands of African Americans transformed and refreshed its meaning. This was doubly ensured by television, which for so many Americans is the main organ of social memory.
That one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able...
But the cadences of King's speech fit the classic form of the memorial in a way that reminds you what has been lost in our age of sound bites. The speed and pseudo-intimacy of TV have killed the classic ideal of the heroic monument, just as they destroyed great rhetoric.
Years ago, I was interviewing Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, and I asked him whether the vast monumental designs of Nazism would have been any different if there had been television in the Third Reich. Well, of course they would have been, said Speer. We could have put the Fuhrer in every living room. We could have done for him what the Americans did for Kennedy. It's absurd to imagine today that anybody would get a political edge from having a statue of himself. Politicians buy television time instead. Ronald Reagan, who was television incarnate, knew this in his bones. Once we know our politicians on television, there's no way of imagining them back into bronze or marble.
Can you imagine anybody giving a hoot what a statue of Reagan or Bush or Bill Clinton would look like? But media images, that's another story.